The girl was 15 years old when the palace decided her childhood was over. From the outside, the day looked like a celebration. Courtyards were washed, silk banners were lifted into the air, and servants moved with rehearsed precision through the inner halls of the imperial palace. She wore heavy embroidered fabric that pressed against her shoulders and slowed her steps. Every layer of clothing reminded her that she no longer belonged to herself. She had been told she was walking toward marriage, toward honor, toward a future secured by the empire itself. But nothing in her mother's eyes that morning spoke of joy. There was only restraint, the kind learned by women who understood that protest inside these walls was more dangerous than silence. The door she was led through did not resemble a bridal chamber. It was narrow, guarded, and deliberately unadorned. When it closed behind her, the sound was not ceremonial. It was final. The women waiting inside were not family or guests. They were attendants trained to observe, instruct, and remember. Their faces showed no cruelty, but no mercy either. This was routine to them. A court physician stood near the wall, holding writing tools rather than instruments, because his task was not to heal, but to record. What was about to happen was not personal, and that was the most frightening part. It was administrative. It was imperial. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman state perfected systems that turned private lives into tools of governance. Power was not enforced only on battlefields. It was enforced in rooms like this, behind sealed doors, where obedience was shaped early and permanently. Daughters of sultans were raised knowing they were valuable, but value did not mean freedom. It meant usefulness. From birth, their lives were planned as extensions of policy, their marriages designed to neutralize threats, secure alliances, or reward loyalty. Love was irrelevant. Choice was dangerous. Silence was survival. The imperial harem, often imagined as a place of indulgence, functioned more like a controlled institution. Every movement was monitored, every relationship calculated. By the 17th century, this world had grown vast and deeply political, housing hundreds of women whose futures depended on rules that were never written openly. Advancement required absolute compliance. Any deviation, any emotional attachment that conflicted with imperial needs, could result in confinement, isolation, or erasure from history. The princess understood this, not because it was explained to her, but because fear had been taught carefully. Over years, through observation, this ceremony, hidden from official celebration, existed to send a message. It reminded her that her body, her reputation, and her future were all properties of the state. She was not being punished. She was being prepared to obey, to endure, and to never mistake privilege for autonomy. The women around her were witnesses not for protection, but for accountability. What happened in this room would follow her for the rest of her life, shaping how she was seen, judged, and remembered within the palace hierarchy God outside. Music would soon play. Gold would be distributed. Poets would write verses praising harmony and divine order. None of them would mention this room. None of them would describe the fear, the confusion, or the quiet realization settling into the mind of a child who now understood that imperial marriage had nothing to do with happiness. It was a mechanism, a locked door, and once it closed, it never truly opened again. What the empire demanded from its daughters was not blood, but submission so complete that resistance would never even be imagined. And this was only the beginning dot by the time an Ottoman princess reached adolescence. Her fate had already been negotiated in rooms she would never enter. Men twice her age discussed her future over maps, letters, and whispered calculations. Her name was not spoken with affection, but with strategy. She was not seen as a daughter first, but as a stabilizing force, a living contract meant to secure loyalty or silence ambition. In the empire's logic, blood carried responsibility. Royal blood carried obligation, and obligation always came with a cost. From childhood, princesses were raised apart from ordinary life, not to protect them, but to shape them. Every lesson, every prayer, every rule of conduct reinforced a single truth: the empire came before the self. They learned how to speak carefully, how to control their expressions, how to listen without reacting. Even joy was regulated. Excess emotion was considered a weakness, and weakness was dangerous in a palace where survival depended on perception. By the time marriage was mentioned, most girls already understood that refusal was not an option. It was not framed as a choice. It was framed as destiny. Marriage for an imperial daughter was never about union. It was about placement. The man chosen for her was often a powerful official or military commander whose loyalty needed to be secured. He gained status through proximity to the dynasty, while she lost autonomy through distance from her own family. Once married, she would be removed from the palace and sent to a residence assigned by the state. On paper, this looked like honor. In reality, it was exile wrapped in silk. She could not remarry if widowed. She could not return freely. Her movements, finances, and correspondence remained under surveillance. The most brutal aspect of this system was not physical punishment, but psychological certainty. The princess knew that her value was conditional. Obedience ensured comfort. Disobedience invited disappearance. The empire rarely needed to threaten. Fear was inherited, passed down through generations of women who learned when to speak and when to endure. Mothers taught daughters not with words, but with glances, pauses, and silences heavy with meaning. By the time a girl stood before her ceremonial future, she already understood what was expected of her body and her silence. What history often omits is how deliberately this pressure was maintained. Rituals, rules, and unspoken customs worked together to break resistance before it could form. Isolation was key. Princesses were kept distant from common people and from one another, limiting shared grief or rebellion. Even grief itself was managed. Mourning had boundaries. Tears had schedules. Anything that suggested personal suffering beyond what was permitted risked being interpreted as defiance. The price of blood was not death. It was endurance. To live long enough to fulfill a role without ever claiming ownership of one's life. This was considered success. Records celebrated obedient daughters and ignored those who struggled. Over time, the silence became tradition, and tradition became justification. Later chroniclers would describe these marriages as honorable alliances, carefully avoiding the emotional wreckage left behind. But inside the system, everyone understood the truth. Power demanded proof of loyalty, and the most reliable proof was sacrifice. A princess who submitted completely demonstrated that the dynasty's authority extended even into the most intimate corners of life. Her compliance reassured the empire that no bond was stronger than command, not even blood. And yet, beneath the obedience, something dangerous remained: memory, because even when voices were controlled and records were cleaned, the women remembered. They carried the knowledge of what had been taken from them and what had been demanded in exchange for survival. The empire relied on their silence, but it was a silence filled with awareness. And awareness, when ignored long enough, has a way of resurfacing where power least expects it. There were practices inside the Ottoman palace that had no official titles, no formal descriptions, and no place in celebratory records. They existed in the space between law and silence, carried out because they had always been carried out, justified because no one dared question them. This was one of those rituals. It was never announced publicly, never explained to the girls who were subjected to it, and never discussed openly by the men who approved it. To name it would have been to admit it existed, and admission was dangerous. So it survived without a name, protected by ambiguity and fear. The ritual was designed to mark a transition, not from girlhood to womanhood, but from personhood to possession. It was not about celebration or faith, but about confirmation. Confirmation that the princess understood her place, her limits, and the consequences of forgetting them. Everything about the setting reinforced this message. The room was quiet, deliberately plain, stripped of the luxury that filled most corners of the palace. This was not a place for beauty. It was a place for submission. The attendants followed precise movements learned through repetition, not emotion. Their distance was intentional. Compassion would have weakened the ritual's purpose. What made this ceremony especially effective was its invisibility. Because it was never written down in detail, it could not be challenged by later generations. It left no physical monument, no official decree, no trace that historians could easily point to. Instead, it lived in personal memory, in whispers passed from older women to younger ones, always incomplete, always vague, always frightening. The lack of clarity was itself a tool. Fear grows strongest when the boundaries of harm are unclear. For the princess, the experience reshaped her understanding of the palace overnight. The walls she once believed protected her now felt like instruments of control. She learned that privacy did not exist, that her body was subject to observation, judgment, and documentation. Even her reactions mattered. Calm was praised. Resistance was noted. Silence was safest. From that moment forward, she understood that every step she took would be interpreted through the lens of obedience. The ritual did not end when she left the room. It followed her into every corridor and conversation. This process also served another purpose. It isolated the princess psychologically from the outside world. Once she had passed through this unseen threshold, she could never fully explain her experience to anyone beyond the palace. The words did not exist. Even if she tried, no one would understand. This isolation deepened her dependence on the very system that confined her. The empire did not need chains. It needed internal acceptance. And acceptance was built through moments like this. Moments that broke resistance quietly and permanently. Later accounts of Ottoman life would romanticize the harem as a place of intrigue and beauty, filled with music, gardens, and luxury. That image was not entirely false, but it was incomplete. Beneath the surface existed a network of controls that ensured loyalty without constant force. The unnamed ritual was part of that network. It taught fear early, before rebellion could take shape. It ensured that even the most privileged women understood the cost of disobedience. Historians would later struggle to explain how such practices could exist without widespread documentation. The answer was simple. Silence was enforced not by censorship alone, but by shared interest. Acknowledging the ritual would have exposed the moral contradictions at the heart of imperial power. It was easier to forget, easier to erase, easier to let the suffering of a few remain unspoken, so the image of stability could endure. But forgetting does not mean absence. The effects of the ritual lingered in behavior, in caution, in the careful way princesses navigated their lives afterward. It succeeded because it was never meant to be remembered publicly. It was meant to be felt privately, carried forward in silence, and repeated as long as power demanded unquestioned obedience. And for the empire, that demand never truly faded. Inside the imperial palace, motherhood followed rules that did not exist beyond its walls. A mother could give birth to a princess, raise her in silk and tutors, watch her learn languages and prayers, and still have no power to protect her when the empire made its claim. Love was permitted only until it interfered with duty. Beyond that line, affection became a liability. Mothers learned this early, often through loss, and they passed the lesson on without ever speaking it aloud. When a daughter approached the age of marriage, the change in her mother was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations shortened. Touch lingered longer than usual, as if memorizing what would soon be taken away. Advice became indirect, hidden inside stories and warnings that sounded ordinary to outsiders, but carried sharp meaning within the palace. A mother could not say, "You will suffer." She could only say, "Be careful." She could not say, "You have no choice." She could only say, "Do not resist." These were not failures of courage. They were acts of survival. Many of these women had once been girls themselves, led through the same corridors, taught the same silence, subjected to the same unnamed rituals. They knew exactly what awaited their daughters, because they still lived with its consequences. They knew that protest would not save the child, only destroy both of them. In the Ottoman system, punishment rarely needed spectacle. Removal from favor, loss of access, quiet confinement were enough. A mother who interfered risked disappearing from her daughter's life entirely. To remain present at all, she had to comply. This created a cruelty more refined than violence. The daughter sensed that something was wrong, that her future was being shaped without her consent, but the one person she trusted most would not confirm it. The silence felt like betrayal, even when it was not. Mothers looked away, not because they did not care, but because caring openly was dangerous. Their restraint was mistaken for coldness by history, which preferred to see imperial women as passive or complicit rather than trapped within the same system. After marriage, separation became permanent. A princess was sent away, often far from the capital, to live under watch in a residence assigned by the state. Letters were filtered. Visits were rare and supervised. The emotional bond between mother and daughter, once formed, had to be dismantled carefully to prevent divided loyalties. The empire understood that personal attachment could undermine authority. It encouraged distance, not only physically, but emotionally. Some mothers never saw their daughters again. Others watched them fade into controlled lives, reduced to symbols rather than people. Grief was expressed privately, if at all. Public mourning was limited, regulated, and often discouraged. A woman who grieved too openly risked being seen as unstable or ungrateful for the honor the empire had bestowed. So pain was swallowed, day after day, until it became part of the palace air itself. This pattern repeated across generations. Daughters grew into mothers who would one day look away themselves. The system depended on this cycle. It relied on the fact that women who survived it would prioritize endurance over resistance. By breaking them early and isolating them later, the empire ensured continuity without rebellion. No guards were needed between mothers and daughters. Fear did the work efficiently. Yet, beneath the obedience, resentment did not disappear. It simply changed form. It became caution, quiet manipulation, careful alliances formed within the narrow limits allowed. Some women learned to wield influence subtly, protecting what little they could. Others withdrew entirely, accepting invisibility as the safest position. History records very few protests because the cost of protest was designed to be unbearable. Mothers who looked away were not heartless. They were constrained by a structure that punished love when it threatened control. Their silence was not approval. It was evidence of a system so powerful that even maternal instinct had to submit. And in that submission lay one of the empire's darkest achievements: the ability to turn care into compliance and silence into policy. For centuries, the Ottoman palace presented itself as a symbol of order, faith, and divine balance. To the outside world, it was a place of law, ceremony, and unshakable authority. Visitors saw marble courtyards, disciplined officials, and rituals that suggested harmony rather than fear. But the palace was carefully designed to show only what strengthened belief in the empire. What it hid was not chaos, but calculation. Control was most effective when it appeared invisible. The lives of imperial women were central to this illusion. Their silence allowed the empire to claim moral superiority while practicing absolute authority behind closed doors. Princesses were presented as honored figures, their marriages celebrated as signs of unity and prosperity. Official records praised their generosity, their piety, their loyalty. What those records avoided was the cost of producing such obedience. The fear, the isolation, and the emotional erasure were never considered worthy of documentation. The palace relied on architecture as much as law. Corridors twisted intentionally, separating worlds within the same building. Doors marked transitions that could not be reversed. Windows were placed high enough to admit light, but not escape. Even sound was controlled. Thick walls ensured that cries did not travel, that grief remained private. This environment trained its inhabitants to internalize discipline. Over time, enforcement became unnecessary. People learned to regulate themselves. What made this system so effective was that it did not rely on constant punishment. Instead, it used uncertainty. Rules were rarely written clearly. Expectations shifted depending on favor, rank, and circumstance. This ambiguity kept everyone alert and anxious. For princesses, this meant that even correct behavior did not guarantee safety. A single political shift could change everything. A husband could fall from grace. An alliance could collapse. And when that happened, the woman attached to that alliance paid the price, regardless of her actions. Historians long accepted the official narrative because evidence to the contrary was fragmented. Personal letters were destroyed or censored. Court chroniclers were loyal to the dynasty. Foreign observers were kept at a distance from the inner workings of the harem. What survived were indirect clues. Sudden disappearances from records. Long periods where a princess was mentioned only in financial documents, not personal ones. Residences listed without occupants. These gaps were not accidents. They were intentional. In recent years, scholars began to read these silences differently. Instead of asking what was written, they asked why so much was missing. Patterns emerged. Princesses who outlived their political usefulness often vanished from public life without explanation. Some were confined quietly. Others were kept under lifelong supervision, their titles intact, but their agency gone. The absence of scandal was itself evidence of control. The palace did not need public punishment. It perfected quiet removal. This revelation challenges the romantic image of imperial stability. It suggests that order was maintained not through justice, but through fear carefully hidden behind ceremony. The suffering of royal women was not a side effect. It was a feature. Their compliance demonstrated that no one, not even the daughters of sultans, stood above imperial necessity. The palace hid these truths because exposing them would have revealed a contradiction at the heart of empire. Power claimed to protect, yet it consumed. It claimed to honor, yet it erased. By hiding the cost, the empire preserved its image long after its authority began to weaken. But silence is fragile. Over time, fragments surface. Accounts written in exile. Financial records that contradict official praise. Architectural clues that reveal spaces designed for confinement rather than comfort. Together, they tell a story the palace tried to bury. A story not of excess or indulgence, but of restraint enforced so completely that even memory was meant to disappear. What remains now is not a single confession, but an accumulation of absence. And absence, when examined closely, can speak louder than any chronicle. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled slowly, weakened by wars, debt, and internal fractures that no ceremony could conceal. Yet long before its political power faded, its moral contradictions had already taken root. The same system that demanded total obedience from its daughters eventually demanded too much from itself. Control, once perfected, became a burden. Silence, once enforced, became an echo that could no longer be ignored. By the 19th century, Reforms began to reshape the empire's public image. Laws were rewritten. Institutions were modernized. The palace spoke the language of progress. But these changes came too late for the women, whose lives had already been spent inside invisible cages. Their stories were not revisited. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments, no official reckoning. The empire moved forward by stepping over its own shadows, hoping they would disappear with time. What survives today are fragments. A residence listed without explanation. A pension paid to a woman who never appeared in court again. A letter abruptly ending mid-sentence. These are not dramatic confessions, but they are enough. Together, they reveal a system that succeeded by suppressing the humanity of those closest to power. The princesses did not die in mass executions. They lived. And that was the point. Living under constant supervision, stripped of choice, was more useful than martyrdom. It produced obedience without resistance and order without noise. History often measures cruelty by bloodshed. But the Ottoman treatment of its princesses reminds us that domination can be quiet, elegant, and socially acceptable. It can be wrapped in honor and explained as tradition. It can be passed down until no one remembers who created it or why. When suffering becomes routine, it no longer shocks. It becomes invisible. That invisibility was the empire's greatest weapon. The final confession of the Ottoman system is not written in any decree or reform. It is revealed in what it could not sustain. An empire that demanded absolute control over private lives eventually lost its ability to adapt. Fear created stability, but it also created fragility. When loyalty is enforced rather than earned, it collapses the moment enforcement weakens. The same silence that protected power for centuries ensured that when it fell, there were no voices left to defend it. Today, the marble halls still stand. Tourists walk through spaces once designed to isolate and observe. The silence feels peaceful now, but it is not empty. It carries the weight of lives shaped by rules they did not choose. The princesses are remembered not by name, but by absence. By the lives they were not allowed to live. By the futures that were negotiated without their consent. Their story forces an uncomfortable reflection. Power does not always announce its cruelty. Sometimes it whispers it into tradition, hides it in ritual, and calls it necessity. The Ottomans did not invent this form of control, and they were not the last to practice it. But they perfected it with such precision that it survived for centuries without open challenge. In the end, the empire fell, as all empires do. But the cost it demanded from its daughters remains a warning. When obedience is valued more than humanity, survival itself becomes a punishment. And history, no matter how carefully edited, eventually learns to read what was left unsaid.